And I say we'll do something a little different. Esther is not a long book. It's a short, well, it's 10 chapters, but they're not long chapters. And the 10th chapter is only a few verses. And so I'm going to do an introduction here, which will take maybe 10 minutes. And then I want to read the entire book. Scripture talks about the public reading of Scripture, and that's something we just don't do that much of. We read a few verses and we explain it for entirely too long. And so I think it is good on occasion to take the time to read a larger portion of Scripture. And you'll understand why as we go. I might want to do that with the book of Esther. Of all of the narrative literature in the Bible, Esther may be among, if not the most enjoyable to read. It's an incredible story with twists and turns and reversals, and a young, beautiful heroine, and an evil, sinister villain, and absolute last-minute reversals. And it is incredible. And the more I looked at this, the more I realized, boy, I would be remiss if I took what is an incredibly exciting, stirring story and gave you 45 minutes of theological points about it. It would seem like a crime. So I'm going to start with, as I say, about 10 minutes, just because there's, some of you are geeks in the room, and so you insist upon some background and some research. You don't believe me either. Some of you doubt me. You want to see sources. I know, I see you, and so that's okay. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes of some background here, and then we're going to read through the book and let it wash over us. So first of all, why is this book called Esther? Well, it's named for the heroine of the story. Her name appropriately means star, and she does star in this story, not because of her exemplary character or lifestyle, however. She stars in this story because, as the story unfolds, Esther, despite her faults, is used by God to save her people, the Jews, when she risks her life to plead on their behalf. She does have a shining moment or two, but that stands out against a very, very questionable life, frankly. Well, who wrote this book? Like many books of the Old Testament, we don't know. But the detailed knowledge of Persian affairs and palace life suggests somebody that lived in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire at that time, and someone that had access to those involved in the story near the time of the events. The intense interest in Israel's affairs suggests a Jewish writer. So the last few verses of the book also speak in the past tense of Xerxes or Ahasuerus' reign. That's the king here, you'll see. And so the book was likely written by probably a younger Jewish contemporary of Mordecai shortly after the death of Xerxes, sometime before 400 BC. Now let me give you this kind of dense paragraph I've taken directly from Wilkinson and Boa's book, Talk Through the Bible, because it's interesting historically, and they will say it more concisely than I can. But for those of you that wonder about the historicity of the Bible, you can Google some of the names and dates in here, like Herodotus, a historian that you can look up writing about events of that day. And what's interesting is the historical events recorded outside of Scripture line up extremely well with exactly what the Scriptures teach us. So here it is in their words. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name, and Xerxes the Greek name of Kishar. I don't even know how you say that. How do you say that, Greg? Kishayarsh. King of Persia in 486 to 464 BC. Now, according to chapter 1, verse 3, the feast of Xerxes took place in his third year, which would be 483 BC. We don't have to wonder. We can look at secular history and know when this king reigned. Now, this historian, Herodotus, refers to this banquet as the occasion of Xerxes' planning for a military campaign against Greece. But in 479 BC, he was defeated by the Greeks at Salamis. History buffs already know this. Some of you will be interested and can Google it. But he goes on to say, Herodotus tells us that he sought consolation in his harem. There's no one of good character here. A harem is a large collection of the king's wives, let's call them. And this corresponds to the time when he held a contest and crowned Esther queen of Persia. You'll see as we go that he held a contest to find the most beautiful young lady in the kingdom, if you will, thinking that this might help to distract him from his political losses. And if that doesn't sound like the world that we live in, I don't know what does. There's nothing new under the sun, brothers and sisters. People in power tend to abuse it, and there you are. This quote continues, since the events of the rest of the book took place in 473 BC, then the chronological span is 10 years, 483 to 473 BC. So the probable time of authorship is between 464 BC, the end of Xerxes' reign, and about 435 BC. Now, the palace at Susa was destroyed by fire during that period, and such an event would probably have been mentioned. So the historical and linguistic features of Esther do not support a date later than 400 BC, since there's no trace of Greek influence. And after that time, then the Greek Empire had taken over. So for those of you that like history, there you go. There's a good bit of background about the book of Esther and when it was written and where and why. You can go right now, if you want to get tickets, to the country of Iran. Is it Iran or Iran? Iran? Okay, Iran, thank you. If you can go right now, if you want to get tickets to Iran, and you can go to the modern city of Shush, S-H-U-S-H. If you ask my children, they'll tell you I should be the emperor of Shush. It's a word I say a lot. You can go right there, and it is built around. It is on the north and west corner of the archaeological site of Susa, of this site. And there's a lot that's been pulled out of the ground there. Of course, it's all been stolen and put in other museums now in England and other places. But it's a very active archaeological site there. Susa, which was then the capital of the Persian Empire. And so that's a little bit about the background, about the dates. In terms of structure, Dr. Constable, in his online notes called Sonic Light, refers to a chiastic structure proposed by Joyce G. Baldwin, centered on the providence of God and the events of Xerxes' sleepless night. If you turn to the back, a chiastic structure means an X-shaped structure. It's like a sandwich. It's where something is built like a sandwich. And there's things on the outside of the structure, and then you move in, and they parallel each other. And they point like an arrow to what's at the middle of the structure. And this is one take on this. And you can look at that. You have an opening and a background in chapter 1 and an epilogue in chapter 10. Just inside of those, you have the king's first decree in chapters 2 and 3. And you have the king's second decree, which is a reversal of it in chapters 8 and 9. Just inside of those, you have the clash between Haman and Mordecai, chapters 4 and 5. And then you also have Mordecai's triumph over Haman in chapters 6 and 7. So this is like bread and lettuce and tomatoes. But the meat of this whole thing is in chapter 6. And what you get there is this night when the king couldn't sleep and seemingly impossible, in air quotes, coincidences take place. And it begins a chain of events that determines the fate of the Jewish people, changes the course of history in that area. And so what we have, I think, is a book designed to shine the light on God's providential working. By God's providence, we mean the power of God working behind the scenes often to control events in history, just as happens in our own lives. If you think back over your life and some of the seemingly insignificant things that have made all the difference in the world to bring you to this place, that's God's providence at work. And this book, interestingly, never mentions the name of God. The name of God is conspicuously absent, and yet the hand of God is visible in chapter after chapter. And that is by design. This is a book that's designed to make us think hard about how God in his sovereignty works in the little details of life, our lives, other people's lives, the crossing of those lives, all to accomplish his purposes and to fulfill his promises. This book is a beautiful picture of that. If you want a few key verses to highlight in your Bible or mark or underline, I'm all for that. You might check this one as we go through later, 4:14. Mordecai speaking to Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. By the end of the book, the Jews are lifted out of mortal imminent peril. And we see in chapter 8, 16, and 17, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province, in every city, whether the king's command and his edict, or wherever they reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. This book, in part, is explaining the origin of the Jewish festival still celebrated today called Purim, P-U-R-I-M, which is a celebration of God's hand of protection on the Jews throughout history. And isn't it interesting that that's still happening in many ways? You turn on NPR on the way home, and if there's news playing, I bet you they'll be talking about Israel and Gaza. Isn't that interesting? God is still at work ordering affairs relative to Israel. It's amazing. It's amazing. Now, a couple of key themes to watch for as we read. If you've never read through the book of Esther, well, you're in for a treat tonight. And I'm going to try not to spoil the plot before we get there. And so if you're listening and you're like, what is he talking about? What is this book about? Good. You will enjoy this more than the others. But here's a few themes to look for. As I already said, number one, God's providential protection of his people. In the book of Esther, while the name of God is not found anywhere, the hand of God is seen everywhere. Number two is God's people's responsibility to respond obediently to the providential working of God. Just because God is sovereign and working out his plan does not mean that I don't have to respond obediently to what I know of God's will. No, I must. I'm called to. We enter into what God is doing with our own obedience. Number three, the futility of opposing God. No human will prevent God from accomplishing his perfect will for his people. Psalm 2:4 talks about God laughing at the nations when they rage at him. There is no person or leader or nation or coalition of nations that will stay God's hand for an instant. God will do what he has chosen to do for his glory and the good of his children. Now, what relevance has this for today? Well, perhaps we'll save these last 3 points for the end. Remind me at the end. We'll come back to these because I think that this is a book that's highly relevant for us today. And if there's time, maybe we'll tease out some of that relevance. Now, I may have to read a little quickly at points because I want to explain a few things as we go, but I mainly want you to hear the story of Esther tonight so that you can see God's incredible working behind the scenes to bring about exactly what his hand had purposed to take place. So I'm going to start in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. This is the word of the Lord. It says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. And the army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So this is like a 6-month celebration. Maybe like if Disney or a big organization had a 100-year anniversary, you might see year-long celebrations of different kinds. Or a nation with its 250th anniversary, you might see some celebration for months on end. And this is what's happening for 6 months throughout the kingdom. Now when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rods, and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Beautiful. Go and watch the new live-action version of Aladdin and look at a large palace setup, and you can see what this was like. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Instead of the custom of everyone having to raise their glass every time the king did, he said, no, just be free. Party at will. And party is the word. This is not like a black tie affair, probably, where everyone is very prim and proper. You must understand that this is not a book of good character. These are not righteous deeds that are being carried out. This is a party, and it was probably wild and probably debauched, to be honest. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Feasts, banquets are very important throughout the book, and you'll see as we read. It's at banquets where everything happens. Verse 10, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that means drunk, he commanded Mehuman and Biztha and Harbona and Bigtha and Abagtha and Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. For she was lovely to look at. Look, the guy is ripping drunk, and he sends the eunuchs to bring his queen so that they can ogle her. There's nothing appropriate happening here. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena and Sethar and Admatha and Tarshish and Meres and Marsena and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. What do we do? He's got an unruly wife. Quick, let's gather the wise men together. How do we handle this? This sounds like drunk men, doesn't it? Yeah, it is. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the province of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Well, they're already over there having their own women's-only banquet. And now the drunk men are stirring up a conspiracy. This is like a girl power event. She's over there whipping them up into a feministic frenzy. They're all going to start disobeying the king and every other man in the kingdom. Definitely a drunk king and his 7 drunk advisors. You see? There's nothing good happening here among the humans. There's no human heroes here, although there is some commendable moments, very much so, by Mordecai and Esther. This very day, let's see, where am I? Verse 19, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes. Good. I like it. You see, I think that's how he responded. I really do. You have to learn to read the Bible and envision what is happening. Do it, you see. This advice pleased the king, the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed, and he sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. After these things, chapter 2, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. And let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." And this pleased the king, and he did so. Again, we know from history this aligns with a time when he was suffering defeat, and he was licking his wounds. He's seeking some distraction. And so he says, yes, how about it? A nationwide beauty contest to bring some more women into my harem here. Now, there was a Jew in Susa the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, if you weren't here when we did 2 Samuel and 2 Chronicles, 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, then you need to go back and listen to those when they get up online. And if you weren't here when we read Ezra and Nehemiah, then you have to go back and listen to those. And you will remember, as you do, that the nation of Israel, for her disobedience, was deported, first by the Assyrians in the 700s BC, and then by the Babylonians in the 500s BC, and they lived in exile for some time. Some of them came back under the leadership of Ezra, and they rebuilt the temple, and others came back under the leadership of Nehemiah, and they rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem. But many, many Jews stayed spread out in what was then the Babylonian Empire and now the Medo-Persian Empire, because they're the new ruling world power. So this story is focusing, and the camera flies 1,000 miles or so to the east maybe, and focuses on the Jews that chose not to return to the land. And this is taking place probably during the time of Nehemiah, during some of the events there. And so, but we're seeing those Jews that stayed away. Now listen, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Mordecai is raising Esther, the daughter of his uncle, that's his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. Now the young woman had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. Now, the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. She is Jewish, and yet she is not living according to Jewish customs, so much so that no one knew that she was Jewish. Every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Isn't that beautiful? He walks by the court and maybe peeks over the wall and says, "How is Esther?" and keeps track of her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. There's nothing righteous happening in the pages of this book here. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Well, then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. And he granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. He was so pleased with her that he starts forgiving taxes and throwing banquets. Now, verse 19, now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Now, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Well, this is a murder plot. He hears of a coup in the works. Conspiracy. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be true, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Very important turn that comes in later. Mordecai, the uncle, sitting at the gates, hears of a plot to kill the king, goes and tells Esther, says, go tell the king. The king has them hung, and it's written down in the chronicle of his kingdom. Now, chapter 3. Here's where the story starts getting good. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. He wouldn't bow when Haman walked by. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. And they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. It pricked his pride. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. He won't bow down. I don't think it's because he is a faithful Jew who is unwilling to bow in the presence of a pagan king. I think it is simply a matter of pride. I can't find anything in the text to indicate. I mean, he told Esther to hide her Jewish identity. I doubt that he's out there taking a stand for Yahweh. But whatever the case, now all of the Jews and all of the kingdom are in trouble. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots. before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. And now if it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." He's willing to pay a vast sum of silver to kill the Jews. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, and the people also. Do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman had commanded, was written to the king's satraps, and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Now a date has been set to kill all the Jews, and the clock is ticking. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, surprise, surprise. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion because there's a lot of Jews there and throughout the kingdom. But don't worry, the king and his boys will get drunk. Now when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then notice that her first move was to, in essence, hide his Jewish identity and the fact that he was mourning this decree. But he won't accept them. Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. And Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. And Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, so that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, "All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. I can't just go in there or I'll be killed. Only those who are called or those to whom he stretches out his scepter. But if I go marching in there and he doesn't stretch out his scepter, I'll be killed on the spot." And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. He says, Esther, don't you see? You will be killed too. You see, when a law was signed according to the Medes and the Persians, they believed that when the king signed a law, it was ratified by the gods, and therefore it could not be repealed. It had to be followed. Now we come to our key verse, and Mordecai says to her, look, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Here we do have a shining moment for her. One, she calls for a fast. We must assume that that includes prayer. Number two, she sounds a little bit like those in Daniel chapter 3 that say to the king, we will not bow down to you. And we believe that our God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we will not bow down to you. If I perish, I perish. Chapter 5, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. She took her life in her hands to do this. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine after the feast, surprise, surprise, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. And Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. Going to throw a second feast. So Haman went that day, joyful and glad of heart, because she buttered them up. There is wisdom on her part. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches and the number of his sons and the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, why, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. He's preening like a peacock. Yet all this is worth nothing to me. Listen to him pout. So long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He can't take it. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, and then go joyfully with the king to the feast. Well, this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. They worked all night to make a giant gallows to hang a rope and a noose to kill Mordecai on. Isn't this incredible? Now, chapter 6, we have this turn. On that night, that very night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles. And they were read before the king. He said, "Bring me the record of my kingdom and read to me till I fall asleep." And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. This is no coincidence. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, "Well, let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Really? Well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "I know. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king himself has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress that man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Incredible. He is thinking, this day cannot possibly get any better. All my dreams are coming true. And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Great plan, Haman. Now go deploy every last drop of it on Mordecai. Can you imagine the convulsive response he must have had? So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he himself dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Can you imagine this scene? And then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." They're beginning to realize that this just might be a protected people. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, imagine that, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." And then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request." My life and my people's lives. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." And then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he who has dared to do this?" Remember, the king doesn't know yet that she is Jewish. And Esther said, no doubt, pointing across the low table that they reclined at, eating out of a common dish. A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. I like this gal. I like her. And then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Whew. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking. He jumped up, perhaps stumbled, red-faced, and he went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. He is falling down at her feet on the couch where she lay, begging for mercy. But what does that look like to the king, who enters the room, in air quotes, coincidentally at that very moment? It looks like he has ill intentions. You must read this book and understand that there are no coincidences. There is nothing that God is not using for his glory and the good of his people. And that is just as true in your life as it has ever been in anyone's life. Now listen. The king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. I think they put a bag over his head and led him out. Whew. And then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, those gallows are standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, and the king said, 'Hang him on that.' So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the wrath of the king abated." You can't write a story like this, friends. Now, some of you are good writers. I challenge you to write a story this good. I have found that God writes the best stories. They unfold in history. And some of them he has recorded for us truthfully in his word. Chapter 8, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman. Talk about a reversal. The enemy of the Jews, Mordecai, came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Here's my signature. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. And when the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, then let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that's coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" And then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring." Oh, an edict sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. He says we can write a counter decree, but we cannot revoke the decree that has been made. Now the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan. On the 23rd day, an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. And then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 19th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. He basically instated self-defense laws like the ones we have in Texas. They might come for you, but you have your own castle laws now. You can attack anyone in order to protect yourselves and those you love. Verse 13, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Now then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, and a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. So what began with a threat of annihilating the Jews in all 127 provinces has turned into an official celebration among all the Jews, which they then celebrated up until right now. The festival of Purim is celebrated around the world by Jews to this very day because of this protection of God. Now, many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. And the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, destroying and killing them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. Does that sound righteous? Brothers and sisters, there's no righteous heroes in this story. The one hero in this story is the one whose name is not mentioned and yet whose hand is perceived in every chapter. The hero is God. The hero is God who can use sinners to accomplish his will on the earth. Now verse 6, in Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon and Espatha and Poratha and Adalia and Aridatha and Parmashta, and you get the point. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but laid no hand on the plunder. This turned into mass killing. This is like a counter-genocide. That very day, the number of those killed just in Susa the citadel was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Were they acting in self-defense? Or was this an uncalled for strike? And this is a tough book. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives. Well, there you go. Maybe it's self-defense, and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. I don't think we're supposed to know, because this book makes no moral judgments on all these sinful people. There's people that shine in a few moments of faithfulness. There's mostly people that are acting in sin. The hero is God. Now this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and the 14th, and the Jews of the villages, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. As far as we know, this has happened for 2,400 years straight, somewhere in the world. The celebration, that is. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that this evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. They wanted never for God's protection to be forgotten or taken for granted. Well, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Well, King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. I'll just say very briefly on the end of your sheet here, while Haman tried to destroy the Jews for a mass quantity of silver, Israel's leaders succeeded in arresting and killing Jesus for a mere 30 pieces of silver. You see, the ultimate one from the Jewish line would be sold for silver as well. But he would go willingly, and he would not strike back. And when his followers tried, he told them to sheath their swords and healed the ear of the one that they struck. And he went willingly and laid down his own life. that he might die in place of the people. This also is the result of God's direct providence. The apostles understood this, and in Acts 2 and Acts 4 they reflect it. Acts 2:23 says, Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Everything that happened in the arrest and mock trials and slaughter of Jesus was according to the providence of God to bring about the greatest good for his people. And Israel's leaders did only what God's hand and plan had predestined to take place. That's the language of Acts 4:28. We are still living in wonder and awe and amazement of the providence of God. At work among his people, the Jews, throughout history, at work among all peoples throughout history, at work in the life of Jesus, and still at work today in the lives of his children. How good God is. Number 3, Esther was ready to forfeit her life to save her people. Well, Jesus came for this very purpose, to pay definitively for the sins of God's children, to accomplish their salvation. Mark 10:45, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.